One of the big things to come out of the spending review is the fact that Rachel Reeves is U-turning on the initial plans they had to means test the winter fuel payment as being only available for those on pension credit. At the time, I specifically said that you shouldn't means test, you should make things universal. My reasons for saying this was that if you have it as a means test, there'll be some people who miss out who do need to get it, who fall just above the line that you set for the means test. Some people might not apply. Some people might get missed by the system itself. There is a whole host of reasons as to why administering a means test is a bad thing. And this is what I was saying as soon as the policy was announced. The U-turn is essentially changing the threshold with which you get the full winter fuel payment. Now, that threshold is now £35,000, which is almost triple the previous threshold, where pension credit is for people basically on less than what they would be getting from the state pension, which is about 12k. And that was fixed there at that specific limit. Now, what happens is everyone gets it. It is a fully universal payment. But if you're above £35,000, there is a tax taper that claws that money back from everybody else. This is how child benefit already works. So it's not an unreasonable change, and it is basically, in a roundabout way, exactly what I was suggesting. So basically what I'm saying is make me Chancellor of the Exchequer. Put me in the Department for Work and Pensions. I will get the means testing or the tax taper for universal benefit correct to ensure maximum utility of the policy. I won't make the entire voter base get mad at me by doing something silly because I thought I could get away with it because I believe that Osborneism was eternal. And on top of this, I also wouldn't cut PIP. So I think I'm making a good choice. I think I'm making a good pitch for me being a future Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, what's worth doing is letting the actual intricacies of the new means test be explained. And Martin Lewis is the money-saving expert. He was on Good Morning Britain today to explain the ins and outs of the change. Let's have a listen.
You're one of those on the side of the argument here this morning, Martin, saying, OK, however we got here, this is a reasonably good place to be.
Well, yeah, I'm not particularly interested in the politics. I'm not a politician, so I'm not going to be knocking about what people should be doing. We just need to look at the practicals. From my perspective, that's what I focus on. Now, look, I've been on the show berating the government over what it did on the winter fuel payment ever since it did it nearly a year ago. And it would be churlish of me, having been calling for them to make change when they have done a change that is a far better system than it was, to be knocking them for it. Let's go back to what the problem was with the means test. There were two main things. First of all, setting an initial threshold for the means test on winter fuel payment for state pensioners of £11,600 was just too low. The typical energy bill is £1,700, but pensioners tend to be at home more and need the heating on more, so may well be using more than £1,700. So to only help those who earn less than £11,600 last winter, that threshold is now £11,800, meant that people just above that threshold were really struggling without it. Because what you have to remember is last winter, compared to the winter before, we also had all the cost of living payments about the energy crisis. So it wasn't just winter fuel payment that disappeared for many people. There were hundreds of other pounds of payments that went too.
It's important to point out that people will say, well, everyone has bills that are higher because of the cost of living crisis. Why should boomers, who are broadly a little bit more wealthy and have a little bit more income than everybody else, get access to winter fuel payment? And I understand these arguments, but as Martin Lewis rightly pointed out, older people are in more often, they need the heating on longer, they need the heating on higher as well, right? The whole point of the welfare state is to level the playing field in terms of things that people don't really have much control over, to ensure that we have at least a baseline level of subsistence for everybody, right? So it's absolutely reasonable to say, well, if you a boomer who really does, if you're a retired person, an old person who, having a cold house will literally change the length of your life, making sure that everybody, regardless of their income, regardless of the circumstances that they live in, can have access to at least a little bit extra to ensure that we level the playing field between people like me. I don't really need the heating on. Other people certainly do. That levels the playing field, right? Of course, we need to look at leveling the playing field in all other areas of the welfare state and other areas in terms of income and access to assets, right? But I'm not going to use a pre-existing level of inequality generationally to justify hawkish welfare policy. Because fundamentally, my personal belief and support for the sanctity of the welfare state overrides any perceived unfairness in the way that it is distributed. So what I will do is I will attack the fact that there are have-nots who don't get access, than I will people who are perceived to have too much access, who are perceived to not need it. I think that's a worse way of looking at it. Everyone should have access to welfare state. Broadly, that's what we pay in for as a society. That's how we live in society for. So I'll not try and argue that some people shouldn't get access to welfare, but what I should say is that the actual scope should be expanded, both within the cohorts and between cohorts as well.
But the really big problem, and Susanna will remember the one I gave Pat McFadden a hard time about just 3 or 4 weeks ago, is that as someone who has been trying to get people to claim pension credit for the last decade, it is a critically underclaimed benefit. Even after all the publicity we've had, 700,000 eligible pensioners who should be getting pension credit don't claim it, whether they've got onset dementia or it's too difficult or too complicated. So it was an absolutely flawed system for the government to link winter fuel payments with pension credit. And what it meant, let's be really practical, was 700,000 of the poorest and most vulnerable pensioners, those earning less than £11,800, which is when the government says you should get winter fuel payment, were not getting winter fuel payment. And that was a very dangerous situation. So shifting to a system where the payment is automatic, which means all the vulnerable people on the lowest incomes will by default get it, is for me a massive improvement. Okay. Yes.
And this happens every single time you do a means test. Unless you make it universal and then tax it back, which ensures that everyone can access who needs it because the tax receipts are never unfairly distributed, right? Because of the progressive tax system. This is always the best way of doing it in my mind, because you avoid these situations. It's exactly what I was saying before about people slipping through the cracks. Martin Lewis is absolutely expertly, because it's his job, detailed how this happens. Because any means test that you apply for any benefit payment, any welfare at all, will rely on people ensuring that they are within the scope of claiming it and then get access to whatever means test it is to ensure that you're able to apply it. Or the government can miss people out through their own means test by having the wrong data. As most people understand their own tax code and know when they've been taxed, they are always pretty much guaranteed to ensure they're on the right place and paying the right amount so that the government knows. But if the government is the one doing the means test themselves on something nebulous like pension credit, it's scope for so many people to miss out on both when they need it. And as has been pointed out in chat, you also get, as well as people missing out, those who have been given accidental overpayments without realising and having to pay it all back. It's a terrible system having the means test. Well, I also agree with Ben in chat that why not just make winter fuel universal if we realise you all need to use more fuel in winter, right? And then use that as a kind of infrastructure to create a future UBI platform template. I mean, I agree it should be a sliding scale, right? Again, we have the cliff edge problem still with the way that it's been set up. And of course, what I'm actually saying a lot of the time is just tax rich pensioners more. Like, get the rich pensioners to heat the homes of the poorer pensioners. Like, there are plenty of pensioners there living off a fucking £6,000 a month or some shit, from being like landlords and having a private pension and a state pension. You know, get these people to pay for the fucking state pension for other people rather than having to get young working people to pay for it. So now we know that this has all been fixed, right? What's the political consequences of this? Well, there's a big political consequence, and there's a bunch of people who will now no longer trust Labour anyway. There'll be a small section of the population, I believe, who will look at this and go, well, at least the government has listened. At least the government realised they got it wrong, and they've tried to make amends for the things that the people didn't like. I don't think this particular cohort is going to be very large. I'm not exactly confident that the people who are going to take the government's word sincere on this is going to be particularly large. I think there's going to be a much bigger cohort of people who have basically lost their trust regardless, and it's not coming back. And they'll look at this and go, it's cynical, they're doing it because people are angry and they just want to lose support. And I'm just like, well, I have no real time for this argumentation, because isn't the whole point of politics that you listen to what the public want? I understand you're always trying to bribe the electorate and they're just sad that they're losing votes. Well, it's their job to win votes. Like, it's their job to win votes, right? So whilst I think the damage has been done and that is the true political consequence, I think people who do think that specifically for this policy are overreacting. They're especially overreacting as well, because a lot of the people who were previously not getting winter fuel payment, even those on 35k, in a double income household, both on 34k, for example, they don't need the winter fuel payment anyway. Like, they were just using it to buy Christmas presents. So if we're actually going to talk real political damage, the political damage should be coming from the PIP cuts. I mentioned this on Navarro, I'll mention this again now, which is that there is a level of unfairness with which both the papers and the public consciousness has really hammered Labour over their cut in the winter fuel payment, cross-ideological boundaries, by the way. Tories, Reform, Lib Dem, Green, SNP, the press on all sides and in the public consciousness of every generation, by the way, which is going to be important later, all think that it was bad to remove the winter fuel payment, apart from Labour voting young people who would just get mad at boomers getting things that they perceive not to need, and I have sympathy with this. But no such level of universal condemnation has been levied at the government for their cuts to PIP, which is going to cause a far bigger increase in poverty, because way more people are going to be in poverty because of the PIP cuts than there were going to be an increase in those of the elderly and pensioners, which wasn't zero. There was tens of thousands of pensioners living in fuel poverty because of the cuts. Like, I'm not going to defend that. But if you're going to look at what is the worst policy here, it's obviously the PIP cuts. That's the most negative utility. But there wasn't a cross-ideological support for reinstating PIP in the way that there was for reinstating the universal winter fuel payment, because Reform and the Tories didn't oppose the PIP cuts and in fact wanted them to go further, especially when Mel Stride was the one who was drawing up plans for bigger disability cuts in his role as the secretary at the DWP before they were ousted from government and is now the Shadow Chancellor. He was at the dispatch box saying, look inside your heart, you know you want to take away the winter fuel payment. But then in reality, he is arguing for real kind of democidal policy towards the disabled by doing more than double the Labour Party did for cutting disability benefits, when of course disability benefits keep loads of people alive, right, and keeps loads of disabled people in work. It's a terrible, terrible cut, and I've spoken at length. I'm not going to go over that again, but you can watch my other videos to understand my full opinion. But the political consequences of the PIP cuts have been way less universal in their condemnation. Now, to be true, people haven't been happy with the PIP cuts. They've not been happy in the Labour heartlands. I think that you're probably going to see more Labour voters who've turned away from them over PIP cuts than have done over winter fuel. I think that's probably true, right? But it's the narrative that really gets me. The elderly who do need help, but not to the same extent and not as widespread in terms of the overall cohort, seem to be getting incredibly universal sympathy, where disabled just aren't getting it, because there's this narrative that the disabled are the undeserving poor. They're faking it. It's the mental health mafia, as an internal Labour source is claimed to have said by The Guardian, because of course the Labour Party is full of monsters. And the other thing as well is that there is a perceived intergenerational unfairness. I was alluding to it earlier, which is that young people don't get the winter fuel payment. Young people also have to heat their homes, not to the same extent, of course, which I did explain earlier as well, right? But most young people are on below median earnings, which is the threshold. Basically, the median salary is the threshold for keeping the winter fuel payment now. And what's the government doing to help these people? Where's the welfare payment? Where is the universal basic income? Where is the cost of living stipend for the young people in this country who are finding it really hard as well right now? The people who vote for Labour. It's obvious, really, that the force behind the U-turn on the winter fuel is the fact that boomers vote and young people don't. That's the real unfairness here. What's funny, though, is I actually don't think there's going to be much of a political consequence for this. I don't think there is. More Common did polling on this, and young people were just as likely, if not more likely, to think that the winter fuel cuts were bad as elderly generations, for example. Whilst there is a very individualistic streak in a lot of the generation who grew up as the children of Thatcher, young people who were the children of Corbyn and of the post-financial crisis era have a much more solidarity, a much more communitarian worldview. And so the idea that government would freeze granny, it's not good for young people. They don't perceive it to be a good thing, and they've never, ever had any level of sympathy to Osborneism, which a lot of older generations do, and in fact they were just aggrieved that Labour would be doing any cuts at all. And so when you see things like the news agents here, we're going to watch a video of theirs in a second. Essentially, the thumbnail for this video is saying the screw youth, and it's a U-turn that could ruin Labour. And my assumption is that the narrative here is that it shows you that they don't care about young people. And I don't think they do either. I don't think that's true at all. They care about young people. But I don't think it's this U-turn that's the problem. Just, you need to offer them some actual policy. Let's have a listen to what they have to say.
Saying, yeah, we were right with the winter fuel allowance last year, and we're right this year. It's not a big U-turn, it's just that we've stabilised the economy. Anyone actually believe that?
The gap in total spending on children and pensioners has widened by 170% in real terms. So why don't we care about the position of young people as much as we seem to care about pensioners? Are they simply off limits for our politicians?
I mean, this is all true. This is all true. The fact that in the public consciousness, the two-child benefit gap is still broadly supported in plurality, unless you really go into the results of that. The people are very happy to starve children to punish parents, yet as soon as you take away money from the electoral cohort that's the right-wing supports and that the press never touches, suddenly there's universal levels of support, right? It's really unfair. But again, it's not actually changing the way that people look at the elections.
Actually, one of the things about this government over the course of the last year, it's actually had a pretty ironclad will. This is its first major U-turn, its first major reversal. And you can see, I think they feel uncomfortable about it for all sorts of reasons. And so what they're doing, partly to try and sort of assuage themselves in a way, or assure themselves that they're still projecting this kind of power and authority, is they're basically making cabinet ministers go out there, including the Prime Minister himself, saying, we've stabilised the economy by making these cuts, so it's time to reverse them. It makes no sense. There is no logic to it whatsoever. The truth is that if anything, the Chancellor's fiscal position has deteriorated since she made those cuts last year.
I mean, yeah, it's all narrativization. Lewis is right to point it out, right? The economic situation hasn't changed at all, right? They're just going to have to make cuts elsewhere and look at the spending review. And essentially to appease the grey vote, I mean, again, it's a policy I'm glad that they're doing, but it should be done via tax increases that they've already ruled out, rather than by cutting departmental spending elsewhere, right? Because that almost certainly, if she sticks to her fiscal rules, come out of funding for education or for the Justice Secretary, right? It's 1.25 billion. It's not a huge amount. I've said that before, right? But that's 1.25 billion that could be being spent elsewhere. Or we could be taxing more. We could just be increasing taxes. As I said, we could just add a higher tax on pensioners. Just call it the winter fuel tax and redistribute it from rich pensioners to poor pensioners. There are loads of taxes you could raise to ensure that you didn't have to make departmental cuts, but that is now what is going to happen.
Yeah. And so we're in a position now, a pretty sort of crazy position, I think, really, where largely because of the political reaction, and we've talked on the show before, there's no doubt this has had a serious, this idea around winter fuel, it's embedded itself seriously with the public. We're now in a situation where, as a result of the changes they announced yesterday, there'll be a threshold where, in a couple where one person is aged 80, they'll receive £200. The other will receive £100. The person over 80 will repay £200 if their income is more than $35,000 a year. But that will create some quirks, this new system, right? Because a single pensioner living alone will repay the full £200 or £300 if their income is more than $35,000 a year, while a couple with an income of $69,000 would keep all of the money. And of course, this is on the basis of income. So you could have a pensioner who has £1 million in the bank, who is off all year, sort of sailing around the world, sort of, having a...
I mean, I just don't care, right? I'm sorry. Again, we're going back down the road of these people shouldn't get it because they're too wealthy, right? Okay, no level of tax tape or tax clawback is going to be perfect in its implementation. But at the end of the day, the fundamental point of removing the means test is to ensure that everyone who needs it gets it. And that is all I care about. That is all I care about. As long as you design the policy so that everyone who needs it gets it, and at least a non-zero amount of people who absolutely don't need it don't get it, then you've succeeded, right? I'm not going to bash the government for designing a policy that is imperfect but has positive utility, which is just the endless circle that we get behind when we live in this world of finite fixed government spending, because of fiscal rules and lack of understanding of monetary and fiscal policy, and broadly the fact that everything is fully fixed by the fact that the government have entirely boxed themselves in by refusing to raise taxes. Because at the end of the day, all we're saying is, well, the young people don't get this, the boomers do get this, children don't get this, the disabled don't get this, what are we doing here, how are we going to move money around, where's departmental spending going to go, when we could be talking about who's going to be taxed more. Why are we not just accepting the fact that taxes are going to have to go up? When will the public get the picture that our tax level is not high enough for our current demographic aging society? We need to raise taxes. The question is, who do those taxes go on? And we're not having this conversation. We're moving a fixed pot of money around, which we shouldn't have to do.
Great retirement, good luck to them, but would still qualify for the winter fuel payment. So when the government says that we're taking away from all rich pensioners, that is not necessarily the case. If you have a lot of assets but no income, you're getting this money.
Yeah, and I guess the question that it really raises is, what is it about the pensioner class, the pensioner set of society, which makes the government so scared of upsetting them. And it is something, I mean, you can read the polling and definitely, the government has a point. 49% of people believe that more money should be found to maintain the services that go to older people as the number of retired people grows, even if that means more taxes for younger generations. But it is extraordinary when you actually look at the breakdown on real per person public spending, which on pensioners increased by 55% between 2004 and last year. And it was just 20% for children. And as I said at the beginning, that has created this massive imbalance, a massive gap in total spending on children and pensioners, which has widened by 170%. And
that's the thing, is that at no point is anyone in the press actually telling the real story here, which is that pensioner poverty, which was a real problem in like the 2000s and 2010s, right? It was a really big story, the level of pensioner poverty we had compared to other countries, right? At a time when the Blair administration under Brown as Chancellor actually had really eradicated child poverty in this country. Pensioner poverty was still a problem, and it was fixed by the triple lock of them into fuel payment. These were good welfare policies at the time. Yet the austerity budgets of the Cameron and Osborne governments slashed welfare for kids, and now we have a gigantic ballooning child poverty problem, which should shame the nation. It should be an international disgrace, the level of children we have that go home hungry, right? Remember that picture of the kid from the Channel 4 Dispatches documentary saying we try not to eat a lot in one day? Like, how that there are people who go out there and still put the cross next to the Conservative box. It absolutely blows my mind. It sends my noggin into the fucking stratosphere. That after watching the videos of those starving kids, people will look at that and they'll vote Tory, or they'll say things like, well, they were right to keep the two-child benefit cap, stop having kids you can't afford. I'm like, well, the kids don't fucking choose this, do they? Looking at that and deciding to still vote Tory or support cuts to welfare for kids, like, you have no soul. You are soulless. You're a husk of a human being, if you can even call these people human, right? That's the reality, is the pensioner poverty, which was a problem, and people have got into their heads that it's a problem, it's broadly a problem that's been solved. And people haven't actually managed to kind of adapt to the fact that we live in a new reality of child poverty. And partly it's because of this welfare system that is skewed one way. But again, I believe in universal welfare. I believe in a strong welfare state. And rather than talking about where we cut to move it to another place, why don't we make the welfare state good for everybody, rather than try and zero-sum our way into robbing Peter to pay Paul?
Of course, you don't have to set generations off against each other. I mean, many children want their grandparents to be well looked after and warm and well fed and solvent. Of course they do. And I guess many, middle-aged people are thinking, well, that's fine, because it's going to be me next. Don't take away anything that will be part of my retirement and my old age. But it does suggest somewhere along the lines that even Labour, which is massively supported by the young and massively out of favour by the over 65s, doesn't feel able to turn around and say, broadly, the pensioners are pretty well looked after compared to working age families, compared to younger people.
I suppose.
Or the disabled, of course. But the problem is, as I said before, there's a voting propensity issue. But, when you look at the fact that disabled people don't really have any voices to speak for them, they're a much smaller cohort. Of course, lots of kids don't vote, and lots of families with kids are less likely to be politically engaged. But there's still a large cohort of people there. The disabled are a tiny cohort in comparison to the retired. And so they just don't get a voice, don't get a look in. And our press are hugely to blame for the ways in which that we have skewed the conversation and the narrative in this country, because the press throw out year after year after year of disabled people being killed by George Osborne, by Ian Duncan Smith, right? Like the absolute kind of blood that flowed in the wake of the disability policy of the coalition government and beyond, right? Zero reporting on it at the time. It took up until the 2017 election, when in a debate between Dominic Raab and Emily Thornberry, with an audience there, hosted by Victoria Derbyshire during the election period, somebody who was Scottish said literally disabled people are fleeing England to Scotland because at least the SNP will look after them. Like, that's how dire the situation was for the disabled during the coalition era. Did this get a fucking peep out of the mainstream media in the way that the mainstream media cover the winter fuel allowance day after day after day after day right now? Of course it didn't. Not in the slightest, right? There was universal acceptance in the media that what Osborne was doing was absolutely necessary at the time when he was increasing welfare for the boomers who voted broadly for the Conservative Party. It's such a damning indictment on the politics and the political media class of this country that the disabled just get thrown by the wayside every time. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.